One of the wonderful things about leading an organization is you get to take the credit for all of the work of other people. And all of the work of other people is what has made this morning happen. And I'd ask everyone from the World Agroforestry Centre to wave your hand if you've been responsible for that.
And Yvonne, who's outside.
And Yvonne, who's outside. So thanks very much for your contributions. Well, good morning, everyone, and all protocols observed. The road to Rio for the RIO+20 event. Well, the good news is we all agree we've got to do more. The bad news is we don't agree about how to go about it. And that is the shame. Literally hundreds of negotiators from 200 countries have been trying to agree on the text for Rio, trying to negotiate it. As of last week, there were 421 paragraphs. How many of those do you think were agreed? 20. So after all of this build-up, we're at a stage now where the negotiations are going round and round in circles. And yet we've got these two very large issues ahead of us: the green economy and sustainable development. Agriculture is mentioned in only 3 of the sections in the text. Forestry in 4. That is largely an underrepresentation, given that both agriculture and forestry together account for 8 billion hectares of our 13 billion hectares of land. Certainly, we're not paying it enough, both of those areas, enough attention. Well, I'm fortunate enough to work for the World Agroforestry Centre, and agroforestry is essentially about 2 things. It's about the practice of growing trees in farms and in rural landscapes for products, tree products, and tree services. And it is also about the social and biophysical benefits you get from using trees as an entry point. And here a good example would be land tenure. Many governments around the world are a little shy of giving land tenure to some communities, to some indigenous peoples, but often tree tenure can be that intermediate step. And here we see agroforestry in that social dialogue and helping rural communities negotiate as being incredibly important. Studies in Kenya from 22,000 aerial photographs that we've taken show that farmers invest 5 times in terms of tree covers and tree crops, woodlots, boundary plantings, when they have land tenure against when they don't. And the income that they derive from that land with land tenure is more than double. And that accounts for both the biophysical location and the climatic variables of the locations that we're in. So agroforestry is about both agriculture and forestry. Agriculture is especially important in Africa, where it accounts for more than 1/4 of total GDP and more than 60% of labour. But we vastly under-support agriculture. Agriculture research is dwindling. Agriculture extension in many places is non-existent. Infrastructure is lacking and inputs are minimal. In China, 200 kilograms of fertilizer are used per hectare per year. In Africa, the average is 8 kilograms. So what that means is, in China, farmers go out into the field with a wheelbarrow and literally shovel the fertilizer onto their fields, spreading it around. In Africa, it's more like a seasoning. 8 kilograms per hectare, that's 0.8 grams of a square meter. So if you take a meter by meter, that's literally that, once a year. And is that going to give us the food security that we need? So what is food security? Well, food security for a national government is not having to import cereals, having grain reserves full enough to cope with difficulty. Food security for the urban dweller is cheap and available food. And food security for the rural smallholder is trying to minimize that hunger gap and perhaps having some off-farm labor opportunities. And we need to pay attention to all three dimensions of food security and involve not only governments and civil society, but also the private sector in helping to advance the sustainability of agriculture and of our planet. Take certification as an example and the role of the private sector. 20 years ago, it was civil society that took off and led the conceptual development and implementation of certification. Private sector soon followed with enlightened self-interest. Where are governments in relation to certification? Lagging way behind. And if we're to use instruments such as standards and certification and market access opportunities, we've got to involve government much more in that. But government is also, particularly in the developing countries, right in one way to shy away. Because many people view certification as consumer guilt for those in Western countries. Have you cut down any forests this week? No. Tick. Are you using any child labor? Jolly good. Tick. Are you using any unsafe practices? Fantastic. Tick. Any dangerous chemicals being used? No. Jolly good. Certified. But if a coffee farmer is only producing 400 kilograms of coffee per hectare, and you certify that farmer as not having cut down any forests, not using any child labor, not using any dangerous practices or chemicals, if you certify their production at 400 kilos per hectare, you're certifying them into poverty. So why don't we set 1,000 kilograms per hectare as a minimum threshold for sustainability, as a minimum threshold for what the farmer wants, what the government wants, and take that as a proxy that everything else is right, that marketing is working, infrastructure is behind it, good government policies on taxation, incentives, etc. are in place to make that happen. And not only think about the guilty consumer in the north. So we see trees as one viable and attractive option. We know that they can make small farmers more bulletproof to climate change, adding organic matter to the soil, increasing water holding capacity, increasing options for enterprise and income for farmers. They can be sold, eaten, or burnt. Payments for environmental services is one of those things we've been studying for the last decade, and in fact just released a publication on it, a summary publication on it, for things such as carbon and water and biodiversity. And there's one of three things we can do in relation to payments for environmental services. We can pay you to stop doing something. We can pay you to do something new. Or we can provide a co-investment for what is good for those communities to be doing anyway. Because if you pay a farmer to do something that they wouldn't stop doing if the money wasn't there, when you stop paying them, what happens? They go back to the old practices. And that's part of the problem with REDD, reducing deforestation and degradation in developing countries. It is a fantastic intent, a fantastic idea to save the world's forests. But unfortunately, it's a poor instrument. There's so much is being loaded on top of it now. Land tenure, indigenous people's rights, safeguards, leakage, additionality. That poor donkey that was carrying the hopes of stopping deforestation now is overloaded. And why? Well, because the market is not going to solve deforestation. The carbon market is not going to solve deforestation. And looking at only carbon and forests is partial accounting. It's not looking at the whole landscape. Take a cubic meter of wood, so a piece of wood 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. If you sell that on the carbon market, it's worth about $5. Sell it as firewood, it's worth about $50. Wholesale timber as a log, it's about $250. Retail timber, go to Ngong Road, retail timber, it's worth about $500. If you're lucky and you've got certified, FSC certified European beech or mahogany from Brazil, it's worth about $5,000. So why would anybody be interested in the $5 for carbon? It has got to be a reinforcing mechanism. It's got to be something that is worth doing for a good reason anyway, and not just for the value of the carbon. So that is why the World Bank and FAO have come up with the term climate smart agriculture. To put production and income first, and then to reduce emissions, and then to look at mitigation opportunities, and then to look at adaptation. Now we can measure production and income, we can measure reducing emissions, we can even measure mitigation opportunities. How do you measure adaptation? How do you say that this landscape is more adapted than this landscape and should be eligible for some of that $100 billion green fund that is going to be established by 2020? Well, what would the indicators for that be? What would the metrics? How would we measure it? Soil organic matter? Soil organic carbon? Total plant biodiversity? Water use efficiency? Well, we've not only got to focus on those biophysical dimensions, but also on the social dimension. The strength of farmer institutions is going to be a key indicator on the ability to sustain those landscapes and to be productive. So, the challenges that our world faces are immense. In the next 40 years, we have to produce the same amount of food that we've done in the last 8,000 years. Now that's a challenge. And we've got to do that in the face of changing climate. So perhaps there are two major messages that we could share with countries in the run-up to RIO+20. The first one, don't leave the people dimension out of the green economy. The world needs to focus more on the quality of life than on our standard of living. People of many countries, especially those facing austerity measures, are rightly protesting. We want to live in a society, not in an economy. The second point, sustainability is not negotiable. Short-term gains cannot be traded off longer-term survival and prosperity. Thank you for listening.
As Tony has said, is part of the consultative group on international agricultural research, which is part of the consortium, Tony, and we have 15 centers, and 2 of them have got their headquarters here, ILRI and World Agroforestry Center, and then we have got a number of centers with regional offices and so on. Some of them are here, CIMMYT being represented here. ICRAF, as the name says, and if you look at SAT, is semi-arid tropics. And as you know, in the dry areas, there is low rainfall. Not only is it low, but there's a lot of variability. Drought is common, land is degraded, and a large number of the poor live here. And in most cases, governments have neglected them, and that's where we concentrate. We have got poverty, hunger, malnutrition, and as I said, environmental degradation. ICRAF, whatever it is a small organization, so our approach is always partnership-based. And we say in our motto, if you look at it, that we only don't do science for the sake of science. We do science with a human face, looking at the environment where we work in, looking at the people whom we work in, so that we reduce poverty, contribute to it. We contribute to reducing environmental degradation, malnutrition, and the likes. And we also realize, Tony, you have talked about it, that you are talking about somebody who gets $400 per hectare per year. We are saying that a farmer will not invest in green agriculture if you're paying him $5, and at the far end, somebody gets $5,000. So we have got what we call inclusive market-oriented development, that is try to put them as a society, inclusive in nature, so that we mainstream them into the markets. Now, to work in this, we have got certain things. One is that we work on crops, which are basically 5 crops. You can see some of them there. We have got sorghum, for the Swahili purpose, ni mtama. We have got pearl millet. The Swahilis call it owele. We have got pigeon peas, mbazi. We have got groundnuts, and eventually what we call chickpeas. Some of these crops are really grown in dry areas, and we want to make them so we integrate them, but we also realize that farmers in those areas work not only on crops. If you go there, probably their livelihoods, depending on where they are, is food security, sometimes more into livestock, and therefore we work with centers like ILRI to see what we can contribute. So integration is part of it. And my colleague Dave Harris, who is here, will talk about integrating it into the systems perspective. And now, in order to deliver, we have regionalized such that we have got Eastern and Southern Africa, but that is, we break it further so that we have got country offices so that we work with them. And we have made some successes, and some of you have visited us, and some people claim that if you cut my blood, you find pigeon peas. But some of you have gone and so on. We have changed. We realize that Eastern Kenya, the rains have become erratic. Climate change is becoming serious. The length of the growing season has become shorter. So other than integrating breeding for pests and so on, we try to make it shorter to fit into the systems. And the whole of Eastern Kenya now, they have got varieties that fit there. In Tanzania, if you hear about Babati, Karatu, and so on, they're very well known in the world market because of what we worked in a partnership approach. In Malawi is the same, such that, and Mozambique, such that when we started work here with our partners, the area under pigeon pea was about 400,000 hectares. Now it's about 1 million. It is part of the agroforestry system. We are the best sellers in the region of pigeon pea into the Indian market. We have looked at issues of chickpea and climate change, integrated it into the system. Ethiopia is one of the largest exporters. We try to make sure that in the highlands of Kenya, we look at the niche. And therefore, under short range there, we are now integrating it. In Tanzania, 70,000 is now from 5,000. Groundnuts, we look at it in a number of ways and so on. Groundnuts has always been a very important crop in the region, but we had the disease that reduced productivity, that was fixed. Now, the issue of aflatoxin, all of you have heard about aflatoxin in Eastern Kenya. Groundnut that prevented us from selling into international markets. That now we have a kit, very cheap kit of testing aflatoxin to make sure that safe amounts are in the food. So that's fine, that's a symptom of it, but we're also developing management practices to prevent infection of the crop. So those are the things. Then farmers have produced for a long time sorghum, no markets. Diseases come, and therefore the productivity had gone down. So we've worked with our national partners and so on. Now we're working with the private sector. The private sector just like you said, changed very quickly. They've realized that barley is no longer available. So they're trying to replace their barley for brewing industry. We looked at those opportunities to link those farmers with the market. So all these things we're working together. But as I told you, markets is important, society is important, but integrating it at the farm level is the most important. So please, Dave, can you come and give us very quickly how we integrate this into a system perspective? Thank you very much.
Better varieties of crops, better in terms of productive potential, better resistance to pests and diseases, better, more efficient use of water, more efficient use of fertilizer. And that has increased the potential for farmers to increase their productivity. But to realize that potential, farmers have to manage these crops to their best advantage. And in a sense, this is a more difficult way to try to improve farmers' livelihoods, because it's farmers know what to do with seeds. They do the same, they know how to handle seeds, whether they're old seeds or new varieties. To realize the potential of those new varieties, as Tony said earlier, fertilizer, for instance, these new varieties, no matter how good they are genetically, if you're only using 8 kgs per hectare of fertilizer, you're never going to get very high yields. So crop management and improvement of crop management by smallholder farmers is a huge issue for agricultural development. If you look at the booklet which outlines, I think in the packs, which outlines the CG proposals for RIO+20, the very first one includes a call for a multi-sectoral approach. And this is important in relation to the smallholder farmer situation, because the clue's in the name, smallholder. These farms, the best estimate for the distribution of farm size in sub-Saharan Africa is that 80% of farm households have less than 2 hectares of land. And the productivity of a small farm is limited by the size of the farm. So the corollary of this is that there are relatively few full-time smallholder farmers. So the non-agricultural sector, the off-farm sector, becomes very important in the smallholder context. And one of the problems that agricultural researchers have had over many years now is that we have all these technologies that work in a technical sense, and farmers are either unwilling or unable to adopt them. And so we have been evolving towards looking at the problem in what we call a systems context, which is taking in these multi-sectoral components such as seed systems, transport, infrastructure. And we're taking a much more holistic view about what it takes to develop the smallholder agricultural sector. This sounds like a difficult problem, and it is, and it's becoming more difficult in the context of climate change, again, as has been mentioned before. And I just want to highlight that we are working in partnerships in the climate change sense, in particular with the ICRAF, which is the Collaborative Research Program on Climate Change. ICRAF in particular has an ongoing project looking at not just the agricultural technologies that will be required in 30 years to cope with climate change, but also the socio-economic options that might need to be available to smallholder farmers to cope with climate change. And if anybody wants more details, I can